Very warm welcome to all of you. I'm saying hello to our fourth lecture of the third lecture series. And the subject of today is land use, agricultural system, and planetary health diet. And I had the privilege to be invited to the National Dialogue in Germany on preparing the UN Food System Summit 2021, which will happen in New York in September of this year. And again, it kind of reminded me, but on a much deeper level, I understood how critical the subject is of what we are talking about today for all of our work. Perhaps it's even the most critical subject, because if we have a breakthrough in the way how we are doing land use and how agricultural systems, it will have an effect on pretty much all planetary boundaries. So it's not just kind of diminishing risks with climate change, but also biodiversity, water, many others. And at the same time, it has a huge impact on human health. And the interesting thing is also, it is so relevant for both areas. It hasn't really been kind of worked on in an integrated fashion. So there is a huge opportunity for working together jointly and innovating transformative action with regard to nutrition, but also land use and agricultural system. Just to say a few numbers that were also presented yesterday by the chief scientific advisor to the summit, Mr. von Braun. He was pointing out we have about 1 billion people staying hungry, and the number has increased by 60 million in the last 5 years. For a long period of time, the number was decreasing. Now it's increasing again, which is also an effect of all the environmental changes. On the other side, we have about 2 billion people who are overweight. So if you put this together and understand as a risk for health and for the society, it's a huge topic. Now, if you look to costs, we are spending about 8 billion per year for food on the planet. But the externalities, the costs of how we produce food and how we eat is triples this amount. So it's not just 8 billion, it's actually 20 billion. Costs that are not seen, but are coming from the way we're kind of doing the system. So I think it's really, really great that we have 3 great speakers here today. And we will start with Karin Pittel. Karin is a professor of economics at the University of Munich and the director of the Center for Energy, Climate and Resources of the Institut. It's one of the most renowned economic institutes in Germany. At the same time, she's the co-chair of the WBGU. It's a German advisory body for the government on global changes. And this scientific body has done a flagship report last year on land use, which he now will report on. So I'm very happy that you're here, Karin. And I want to ask with a question, which is not really to the topic. When we had our preparational talk, you were pointing out that you're not so used to talk to health professionals, that it's kind of not a thing you're doing every day. Now, in your work also with Sabine, who is joining here, you are kind of getting more affected by health professionals anyhow. So what is your perspective on kind of what can the health professionals bring to this bigger game of the great transformation? So that would be a question to start with.
I think the health professionals and the health considerations altogether can bring a lot to the debate on global environmental change. Because at least in my field, many of the discussions do not involve health repercussions of changing environments, of mass extinction with respect to biodiversity, neither with respect to physical health nor with respect to mental health or well-being. But if you then look at numbers, and there are some numbers that try to get an idea of the repercussions that you're actually facing here, and it's huge numbers. And I think it can actually not only make life better, but also change the perception of what we're doing to ourselves by a lot.
Thank you. So very much looking forward to your presentation. Please go
Thank
ahead.
you, and thank you for inviting me. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let me share my screen. I'm one of those people who actually like PowerPoints. I hope you do too. So again, thank you very much for inviting me and giving you an idea of our last flagship report. The title of this flagship report is Rethinking Land in the Anthropocene, and subtitle From Separation to Integration. And I think it will become clear why we chose that subtitle. When I talk about we are the German Advisory Council on Global Change, which is an advisory body to the German government that is inherently interdisciplinary. So it's neither the economics discipline nor the health discipline dominating, but we have law people, we have geographers, if physicists. So I think it's always, we try to find a balanced approach to all our topics. And like I said, one of them is land use and land use change that we observe, and what kind of threats are actually resulting from that. So where we start from is basically what we label the trilemma of land use, because what we're observing at the moment is three major crises. On the one hand, the climate crisis, so we need climate protection. On the other hand, biodiversity crisis, and then also the not that much talked about food crisis. So you see the kind of approach to our report is broader than the approach in this session, but nevertheless, I think it makes sense for me to kind of give you an overview of the entire kind of broad spectrum of topics we address, because it's all linked. You can't just single out one aspect, but you have to also think about transformations in other areas. And I think our report makes that pretty clear. So the report is basically separated in three stages, three steps. The first is really kind of setting the stage regarding the trilemma that I just talked about. Then from there, we go on to show that there is actually strategies, of which we show 5 exemplary, that manage to tackle and hopefully overcome all 3 of the crises at the same time. And then in the last step, we are presenting 5 approaches to transformative government that in our view are necessary to actually overcome these crises. Of course, there's a lot of more points and tips on what to do for governments, for the society, for firms as well in the report. And I was told that actually the web link to the report is going to be posted in the chat, so you can take a look at that, and perhaps also kind of focus on what's particularly interesting to you, because it's a really encompassing report. But there's also the as a summary, which is 15 to 20 pages, and I think you get a pretty good idea of what the report is about and what we recommend from that summary already. Okay, so let me turn to the trilemma very shortly. Like I said, first, the climate crisis. Desperately need a change in our approach to land, also with respect to climate. Of course, the main cause of the climate crisis is the use of fossil fuels, but also the way we deal with land today is also a source of considerable emissions. Now, you see from this graph that land can, of course, contribute to climate protection, but it cannot solve the problem on itself. So we always argue that dealing with the land climate crisis does not absolve us in any way from driving down our emissions as fast as possible. That is especially relevant because land is, of course, also important in the context of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. So what's in modern language always called negative emissions. But these negative emissions can help us to reach climate neutrality, climate stability, but at the same time, many of them are very land intensive as well. So that has to be taken into account. Second crisis, biodiversity crisis, basically just looking at almost every day's press and media. We are very aware of the problem that humans and their way to deal with land and nature is causing worldwide mass extinction, and we observe extinction rates being up to 1,000 times higher than they would be compared to pre-human times. Now, we are, of course, the main source of the problem. We're changing land and land use. We're using it for settlements, for industry, for agriculture. We overexploit land. Climate change is contributing to the problem, as is pollution and invasive species. And to many people, that's still very abstract, although it does have very severe consequences also for humans, as it means a loss of nature's contributions and services for humans. And these are invaluable, although very subtle in many cases. They range from climate stabilization to pollination to the provision and purification of water. Then our third crisis is the food crisis that we look at, which is going to be focused on one of the other talks. So just kind of repeating what we just heard. We do have enough, at the moment at least, production of food quantitatively, but we do have the problem that it's not accessible to all. We already heard that about a quarter of humanity has too little to eat still, while another quarter is actually eating too much, so we suffers from overconsumption. But then also what is produced is often problematic, as it's many cases high calorie, it has a low amount of micronutrients in it, and at the same time it's produced with severe externalities, with severe repercussions for the environment. And it's not really to be seen that this is alleviating anytime soon, because population worldwide is still growing, and the trend in diets and food systems is kind of still contributing to the problem. Okay, at first glance, it seems hardly possible to really overcome all of these three crises at the same time. But like I said, we try to provide hope that there are actually strategies which help to overcome all three crises at the same time. But in order to get there, you have to move away from the separation, which is shown here on the left side of the graph, where you think about the different crises separately and only with respect to the repercussions of the individual crisis and how to solve it, but not with respect to the spillovers to the other dimensions. But you have to come to a more integrated approach and see also how you can make use of the overlaps between the crisis and the solution approaches. Okay, and for these, like I said, we have five approaches, which we label multiple benefit strategies, because they have benefits not only with respect to one dimension, but also with respect to the other dimensions of the crisis. So this is this is ecosystem restoration, protected area systems, timber-based production, or more generally a sustainable bioeconomy, diversified agriculture, and changing dietary habits. So just a very short overview of over the 5 points. First, ecosystem restoration, initially motivated also by creating carbon sinks that help actually help us reach the 1.5 degree goal, or at least not getting much above that, by kind of compensating for remaining positive emissions. But of course, we have to acknowledge that these things are often not permanent. They do have side effects, not only being land intensive. And so that does, like I said, not absolve us from reducing greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. Now, restoration can make contributions to all three dimensions. Restored ecosystems usually have higher storage of CO2. They foster biodiversity, and by fostering biodiversity, for example, just one little example in the form of insects, they also contribute, for example, to assure secure for the future pollination of plants. So with ecosystem restoration, what we mean, for example, is site-specific restoration. So the re-wetting of peatlands, restoration of grassland ecosystems, and so on. Kind of related, but going a little bit different direction, is the expansion and upgrading of protected area systems. here focus being on systems, not individual areas, but linked systems. And again, this can have benefits with respect to all three of our dimensions. I think climate is clear, also biodiversity is clear. Food security as well. For example, in some protected areas, depending on the degree of protection, you can also conduct agriculture. So you can combine actually climate protection again with food security. What we emphasize especially is that it's not only the quantity that matters, although we argue for at least 30% of the global land area to become or be converted towards protected areas. We also stress that we need a consistent application of internationally agreed quality criteria from that. And we also stress, I think, throughout the report again and again, also the importance that indigenous peoples and local communities have in this context, as they alone care for about 1/4 of the global land surface with respect to the conservation of ecosystems. Third area, and I kind of changed the sequence with respect to, or in comparison to the report, because here the focus is more on agriculture and on food, so this is last. But the third is making the bioeconomy sustainable, responsible, and to promote timber-based production. Here, it's especially important to bear in mind that we don't have unlimited quantities of biomass available, and we have to take care of food security first, of natural carbon reservoirs, preserving those, but also conducting the bioeconomy while not harming biodiversity. Now, what remains is relatively limited amount for all the different demands that are increasing steadily with respect to the bioeconomy. And so our focus is specifically on solutions that actually are able to store carbon for a prolonged time period. That can be cascade uses, for example, in the form of timber-based construction, so using wood for construction purposes. And in this context, we specifically asked the German government to set up, together with other countries, so on an international basis, so-called mission for sustainable construction that actually also incentivizes using these materials and to build sustainable in comparison to standard construction methods. Then our fourth multiple benefit strategies actually diversify farming systems. And of course, there's really heterogeneous demands and challenges worldwide. So what we focus on is the EU and sub-Saharan Africa. In both areas, soils are becoming increasingly degraded just for very different reasons. In the EU, we have excessive use of fertilizers. In sub-Saharan Africa, we basically have insufficient fertilization. At the same time, what we observe globally is really a trend towards less and less types of plants, sorts of plants being actually used in agricultural systems. So what we promote is actually a more diversified, multifunctional, and ecologically intensive agriculture in high-income industrialized countries, but also in low-income countries. That then basically has, again, positive effects on all three dimensions of our crisis. Just one example could be agroforestry system, where you can combining farming and livestock, or agrophotovoltaics, where you can on the one hand, produce energy, on the other hand, also kind of shield fields or agriculture from too much sun, and having then, for example, grain production underneath. Okay, and then the fourth field that we look at is transforming the dietary habits, where we argue that the focus should be equally on human health, but also on the conservation of ecosystem services. At the moment, what we observe is a very high proportion of animal products in people's diets, which of course then has a very negative effect on health as well as on ecosystems. And these livestock products entail many times the emissions of crop production. They also need much more land than, for example, a plant-based diet. And the plant-based diet can thus also relieve the pressure on land. At the same time, of course, what we eat is usually, or is in many cases, pretty unhealthy. Too much meat, too much sugar can cause obesity, diabetes, for example. And then we observe at the same time that more and more countries and regions in this world are actually adopting the dietary habits that were formed in industrialized countries over the last decades. So that's problematic, but also what we observe is really an unsustainable decrease in food prices, which sounds good at first, but of course usually means that not all of the costs that result from food production, from agriculture, are actually internalized, are part of these prices. So it's, if you want, not really true prices. So what we suggest is actually making use of what you can observe, for example, in the EU, but also in other countries. And that is a trend towards a more plant-based diet, towards vegetarianism and a vegan diet. And so we suggest specifically also the planetary health diet that the Eat Lancet Commission recommended to be integrated in dietary guidelines. So less meat, much more fruit, vegetables, nuts, fish, for example, increasing not only human health, but also the planet's health. But we don't think that guidelines alone are enough. We also say that we do need the true prices. This is not going to be easy to implement because higher food prices are, of course, not necessarily something that is something that people would relish. So you also have to, at the same time, if you increase food prices, of course, make sure that this food is still available for all parts of the population. So it comes at the same time with also distributional measures. But you also have to basically, in order to make this type of diet more acceptable, but also more desirable, to make it, to increase exposure of people and to increase the availability. So make people see that it is good and that it tastes good. So public catering, canteens, daycare centers, school can play a major role here. So all of these aspects, they are exemplary, but I think they can actually provide a great impetus with respect to moving into the direction of land use, land system transformation, but they should be supported by 5 governmental governance strategies. And in these, we differentiate between some that are very local, then to the national level, multilateral and global. And I'm not quite sure how much time I have. I hope I'll get through all of these very shortly. So the first is support change agents. So change agents in agriculture, in even the protection of land, there are private initiatives to that, but also with respect to different different dietary habits. I think that should be supported, especially if there's a potential for these change agents to actually become multipliers and to cause kind of like a landslide or an avalanche in the long run. Of course, in order to make that possible, you need to support these change agents as well. So you need a corresponding framework that supports them, that can be supporting their networking and their visibility to actually implement the pricing structures that they need in order for their business models, for example, to become viable. But also in the areas of public infrastructure, education, information, there's a lot of things that can be done. Second one, on the national level has always, of course, the advantage that states have territorial power, so they can set the rules and regulation and enforce them. And In the case of land use, it's basically two paths, two sides. On the one hand, you should create incentives such that positive contributions to a more sustainable land use are actually rewarded. Subsidies, just one example. But on the other hand, that's probably not going to be enough. So you also need regulations, appropriate pricing, but also bans for certain substances and certain practices. So all of this can be done on the national level, but it should be, and I think that's important to emphasize, not something that you just do with respect to one sector, for example, agriculture, but it has to be something that becomes like the foundation of the entire regulational body that a government actually conducts. So it is not in this technology and that technology only, but it has to be considered in everything that's actually done. Of course, it becomes especially challenging to kind of enforce these types of regulations also if you have trade relations, for example, with other countries, to actually make sure that what you get in is also adhering to these guidelines, and also, if possible, to kind of export these values, these ideas, and those regulations. And that's where international bodies and coalitions of countries and the global scale come actually into play. With respect to the EU and other kind of conglomerations of states like it, we see specific potential because these areas usually already share values, they share regulation, there's a joint governance, and that can be used to actually promote these type of transformational approaches to the entire area. Now, in the EU, we just had the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, and at the same time, we have the European Green Deal. So there is already quite some finance resources dedicated towards making agriculture more sustainable, but we still believe that the way it's done yet is not enough, at least not on the EU level. So states have some leeway, some flexibility. So in our view, that would be at least a stepping stone that the member states actually use this in a more sustainable way to enforce more sustainable agriculture. But in the long term, what we propose is actually kind of a common ecosystem policy. So not viewing agriculture, restoration, protection, and everything separately, but treating it more as an integrated approach. And of course, then the EU, by being larger, having more influence on the global stage, is also in a better position to actually support the protection of global commons, and also to ensure via renegotiation or negotiation of trade agreements or trade policies to actually also get these sustainability goals into these agreements. But on the global scale, what we observe already is the so-called Rio Convention. So we have those 3 Rio Conventions: the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the Convention to combat desertification. And all 3 of them are also dealing with land, but only or mostly through their specific perspective. So the goal would be actually to get them together and actually develop a common view on land protection and land use change. So what we think is really desperately needed is a joint conference of 3 Rio Conventions that then can make sure not only, but also that the Convention of Biological Diversity is actually implemented, but also that climate, for example, climate neutrality is implemented, but not at the expense of land use or of the land. Okay, yeah, specific mention, of course, again, that even if you are on the global scale, you should not kind of just take the macro perspective, as economists would say, but have to kind of break down on the micro perspective, taking the rights of indigenous people seriously, also integrating different cultural approaches, such that in the essence, you get a macro framework that is very heterogeneous on a micro level. I'm almost coming to an end. The 5th is actually something that is kind of new in our report. We haven't seen it, at least in this kind of constellation, and that's the establishment of new cooperation alliances. On the one hand, we propose regional alliances. That's basically for countries that have a joint surface area, let's put it like that, or that are connected to each other. And they can basically, like the EU, establish more sustainable land use practices also across borders. For example, also area protection systems across borders, ensuring that trade between them is actually done according to sustainable criteria and so on. But the second one is actually supranational alliances. So also for states that do not have kind of like the already joint government and joint area that they inhabit as the EU, but countries that are more kind of spread out across the globe, but still share values and goals and aims, and they should come together, potentially even giving up some of their territorial rights in order to promote and pursue sustainable land stewardship. And trade agreements, etc. They can, I mean, it's kind of similar to the idea of climate clubs that what was promoted by the Nobel Prize winner in economics, kind of like getting together, sharing the same type of policies, not just with respect to climate, but also with respect to other policies, and then also have a common policy towards all of the countries that are outside of your alliance, of your coalition. And the third one, I think is especially important because it addresses specifically or supports specifically countries also in the global south, where we suggest so-called global conservation alliances, where a number of countries actually comes together to with the aim to support and conserve ecosystems, especially large ecosystem like the Amazon, or like other forest protection conservation measures in Africa, for example. And they jointly would provide not only the regional administrative support, so kind of like on the ground, integrating whatever and wherever ecosystems are supposed to be protected, but also supporting these areas with necessary long-term, not just for 3 or 5 years, typical project duration, but really long-term finances. And we also provide specific examples of how that can be done. And given the problems also on the global scale, we kind of specifically suggest here multilateral approaches that do not need 195 countries, but a lower number that can agree on the same goals and can agree better on how to pursue them. So wrapping up, we have the firm conviction that only if our approach to land stewardship changes fundamentally, we will succeed to actually overcome all three of the above described global crises. In order to get there, we need the so-called 3 S's. On the one hand, we have to have a systemic approach that takes account of all the interrelations in such a highly complex system at land use. That is one key to global sustainability. But at the same time, when looking for solutions to these crises, you have to adopt synergistic approaches that serve not only one goal, but also address the other crises at the same time. And of course, all system and synergy is great, but at the same time, of course, there's also the aspect that it will only work if we approach it on a solidarity-based ground. So not only, which is typically coming into mind, between high income and low income countries, but also within individual countries, with different groups within countries supporting each other in this endeavor. And if that is done, if that is considered, I think there's still a lot of hope to actually turn around and get to a global sustainable transformation of land use, but it is by no means easy, and there's going to be a lot of challenges on the way. So thank you very much for listening to me, probably longer than I was supposed to talk. But unfortunately, I don't see a clock here.
Thank you very much, Karin. And yes, we are a few minutes over time, but we will find a way to compensate. So I directly hand over to Professor Anja Bosy-Westphal. She is leading the Institute for Human Nutrition and Food Sciences at the University of Kiel. She's also the president of the German Society for Clinical Nutrition and sits on many other boards of nutritional societies. We know each other since almost, I think, since half a year now. And I think what you're really moving into very much in your work is an integrated perspective where the environmental dimension plays a much stronger role. So you're a role model of kind of changing the narrow perspective to a broad perspective. And we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for having me here and giving me the chance to present my view on sustainable nutrition and prevention of non-communicable diseases. And I think what is very, very important is that we see this perspective here of the Lancet Obesity Commission. This is a famous article that has been published in 2019. So they put obesity in a greater perspective, actually. So the pandemics of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change, they constitute a syndemic because they interact in time and place, and they have synergistic adverse effects on each other. And importantly, they share also the common underlying social and economic determinants and policy drivers. And from this, we can conclude that obesity is not, as it is in the medical way, often viewed a metabolic or genetic disease, but a target for pharmacotherapy even. But it's really, it's rather a symptom of a, what I would say, systemic malfunction of the food system. This is another view on this pandemic of obesity that we are dealing with. And overweight and obesity is also associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a risk of the complications of COVID-19, so severe complications and even death. And you can see here that hospital admissions, they increase with the BMI. And in Germany, we have about 67% of men, they are overweight, and more than 50% of the women are overweight, and one quarter of the population is already obese. So we are an overweight and obese society. Not only the US is, but we are already also an overweight and obese society. And I deal with this in my research. We look at body composition and about the relationships of body composition with different non-communicable diseases like diabetes, for instance, or cardiovascular disease, or what is really a pandemic is the fatty liver. And we know that obesity is associated with all these diseases, also musculoskeletal diseases. But what is really, really interesting is that we also see, of course, problems in people who are not so obese, who are really look relatively lean. But when you see a little bit further in the body composition, you would discover that they already have also problems with body composition. So they overeat, as we all do. They eat too much calories, but they are not capable of storing their calories properly in adipose tissue. So it's a limited adipose tissue expandability that is leading to metabolic diseases here. Here you have in this massive, with this massive BMI, you can easily see there's a lot of fat storage, but here you can't see this. So So there's a limitation of the fat storage, and then you get the ectopic fat in the organs, and you get all the metabolic problems. That means that the problem of overweight is underestimated in our population even. So we all face this problem of overeating. What I think is really important is that there's also a statement from this Lancet Obesity Commission that holding people responsible for their obesity detracts the attention from the obesogenic systems that produce obesity. So the real drivers of obesity, they are overlooked. In our society, we say everybody is responsible for his or her body weight, so they can exercise more or eat less. So simple the problem. But we have a pandemic of obesity, and even children are obese. So we cannot say people are responsible. We have to look at our environment, and we have to change our environment. And I think a very one part of the obesogenic environment, as we call it, is of course our diet. And one very impressive study that has been published in 1919 by Kevin Hall. He's actually a physicist, but he does very, very exciting studies. I know him, and he looked at the consumption of ultra-processed food and energy intake. And what he did is he did an intervention study where people for 2 weeks were set on an ultra-processed diet, and on 2 other weeks they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted from an unprocessed diet or relatively low processed diet. And you can see on the ultra-processed diet, they gained weight. They actually ate about 500 kilocalories per day more than they needed. And on the other diet, they eat less and they lost weight. So part of the obesogenic system is, of course, our diet that causes obesity. So what is an ultra-processed food? What does it look like? As you can see here, this is unprocessed or very low processed food, and it's consisting of, as you can see here, fresh or dried frozen vegetables, grains, legumes, fruits, very healthy food. And this is the basis, of course, of our meals and what we cook with. The second group would be processed ingredients that we use only in small amounts, like sugar or fat or salt. These are for themselves highly processed, but we only use it in small amounts. And the other group is the processed food group. It's also a very healthy group because it's low processed. It can be part of a healthy diet. It includes, like, for instance, breads and cheese, or here cooked food. So this is low processed food. But this is the group that has a problem for our health, and it's the ultra processed foods group. And this food includes fast food, sugary drinks, so all the soft drinks, snacks, chips, candies, cookies, all kinds of sweetened cereals, and the sauces and dressings and so on. And they are often very nutritionally poor, so they have a lot of calories, but not a lot of valuable ingredients, and nutrients. These foods are modified, but actually it's not that they are, the problem is with processing, but it's also with formulation. So they contain industrial ingredients and a lot of substances that are not good for our health, a lot of additives even, and not a lot of intact food. I will show you in a moment another graph. The purpose of the ultra processed food is that it is convenient, has a high convenience, it's durable, so a long shelf life, it's ready to eat, ready to drink, or you just need to heat it, for instance, very attractive, it's very delicious, people like it a lot, and there's a lot of profit with it. So people gain a lot of money, earn a lot of money with selling those foods. Their effect all over over the world is that they displace the traditional kind of food that people eat, and they are usually branded very assertively. Packet is very attractive, and it's intensively marketed. For instance, I give you one overview that you can see an idea. You have here the original food, let's say it's corn, and you get the starch from the corn, and you get, let's say, from the palm tree, the oil, the palm oil, and you put this into a novel, into a new food, and you destroy the matrix of the original food, and you put a lot of ingredients that are additives. You need texture agents, for instance, taste enhancers, and even coloring agents, and so on, to produce these kinds of ultra-processed food. So these are the characteristics of ultra-processed food. And there are a lot of publications that impressively show that the higher consumption of ultra-processed food has adverse effects. Here you can see it's the total mortality here in this graph. More than 4 servings a day were independently associated with a higher risk, so more than 60% relative increase in the hazard ratio of all-cause mortality compared to the group that has a low intake of those ultra-processed food. And there's also a dose response relationship. So for every additional serving of ultra-processed food, the all-cause mortality increases by 18%. And you can, this is just one example, you can see a lot of publications showing this for diabetes, for instance, or cardiovascular disease, and so on. Now, looking at the suboptimal diet as an important and preventable risk factor for non-communicable diseases, you can see here the systematic evaluation of the global burden of disease studies. So it's a study done in 195 countries, and I just show you here for Western Europe the results. So 15% age standardized proportion of death attributable to individual dietary risk. And you can see what is here in blue and green is that is a low fruit intake, low vegetable intake, low legumes, low whole grain, and in red here, high sodium intake. This is most of this graph, most of the risk is really explained by these factors. So they are the leading dietary risk factors for death, actually. It's when you look at the red meat and the high processed meat, high processed is the bigger part here in this graph, and this is the red meat, this is a very low proportion. And I will not today talk about meat because I think you all know, and it has been shown also in the talk by Karin Pittel before, and by many other talks that we know, and it has is of course maybe in the next talk also a big topic in the planetary health diet, that we have the land use and the greenhouse gas emissions in the diet with a lot of meat consumption. This is a problem, but however, it's a minor impact to non-communicable disease when you compare it with all the other factors, and with the problem of highly processed food that has also problems for our environment, and I will show you in a minute. First, let me stick to the health problems of ultra-processed food. The adverse effects of ultra-processed food, linking them to the non-communicable diseases, are shown here. So you can see the quality of the carbohydrates is a problem. There's less fiber, and the blood sugar is raised too high and too rapid by those carbs, and of course a lot of saturated fatty acids, and very energy dense. So what you've seen from the study by Kevin Hall, people overeat by those diets, and a lot of saturated fat, even in the processed, also in processed food here from animal source. And the healthy plant-based diet also has a lot of phenolics, and so secondary plant products, like we call it, they have health impact, so protective for health, and so a lot of bioactives that are low in such a processed diet. When you go to the supermarket, you find a lot of those products, and only a small part of the supermarket is fresh fruit. And this is an increasing problem, and I've seen supermarkets where you only have processed food, and so this is an increasing problem. The shelf life is good, and there is seemingly a high variety of our food, but this is not a real variety. And as you can see here, the apparent food variety is really like fake, it's because the food contains very low amount of plant species, like it has been mentioned in the talk before already. We have 50% of our calories from the plant-based food are from 3 species only. It's only rice, maize, and wheat. And if you take soy, you find that most of our food in the supermarket is from these plants. And here are only 2 prominent examples where food is based on wheat, or here like the chicken wings, they are made from corn. Even the chicken is raised with corn, and and it's fried in corn oil, and you dip it in the corn syrup, and it's all corn, so this is a problem. And the so-called Green Revolution, it is that the high yielding varieties of cereals that were introduced in the 1950s and late 1960s, that increased the agricultural production. So that was a good part of this Green Revolution. So it helped really to fight the hunger in the world, to save billion people's life that would have who would have starved otherwise and died from starvation. But however, we know today that this Green Revolution has a lot of adverse effects, a lot of side effects, and one is that it reduced the plant species that we have as a basis of our food. So there are a lot of plant species that are edible, but today only a few are cultivated, and very, very few are used as a basis of our the vast majority of our food. And the Green Revolution, the adverse effects were that the crop diversity, not only the crop diversity went down, but also, of course, the intensive agriculture with the fertilizer and pesticide use and water use and soil contamination and loss in ecosystem biodiversity. And this is a hazard, of course, for the genetic resources of our crops, for the resilience of the system. But also, you can see here the external costs that I've mentioned before already by Karin. And this is, of course, a very interesting part. The food is very cheap. So the highly processed food is very, very cheap, but it does not include external costs. And there are estimations from a scientific publication that you could add, let's say, 1/3 of the costs to the food to see the real price of the food. And so the current food systems that we have are becoming more and more industrialized, globalized, and dominated by large actors capable of the economies of scale and maintaining a long supply chains. And this is a problem for, of course, also not only for the environment, but also a danger to the socioeconomic welfare and fair distribution of benefits within the food system. So there's a big discussion about the law about fair supply chains. For instance, you have maybe seen it in the news, or yeah, an exploitation of farm workers, for instance. And this is my final slide, and just some food for thought. Yeah, a healthy dietary pattern is more than just the sum of individual foods. I like this citation a lot from Anthony Fadid. It's ultra-processed food. They are the symbol of the Western reductionist thinking. If the food is only the sum of nutrients, then why not splitting or cracking the food, then recombine the ingredients in endless combinations, like we do it today. But it's, however, to forget that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your great talk. And there are also already many questions. I'll hand over directly to Markus Springmann. We're really pleased that you could join us again, because you were already a guest for our very first Planetary Health Academy. And you're a senior researcher at the Nuffield Department of Public Health at the Oxford University, and one of the lead authors of the Eat Lancet study that appeared almost 2 years ago, and which presented the planetary health diet for the very first time. And yeah, I would say the stage is yours. You will talk a little bit about the planetary health diet, but also what already happened during this last 2 years, and what things changed in a good way, and maybe also like what provoked discussions. So Marco.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Let's see that the screen sharing works here. So I hope you all see this now. So, I mean, much of the background was already covered, and you probably heard about it throughout the different talks. I mean, dietary risks, as you're now aware of, are one of the biggest risk factors for premature mortality in the world and in most regions. And even though the previous talk said red and processed meat are not so important, a lot of things in the 2017 Global Burden of Disease report, a lot of disease associations of red and processed meat that are very well established in meta-analysis were actually not included in that. So I would say it's an underestimate. And I think if you look at others, they usually put that burden of red and processed meat at a bit higher level. But nonetheless, an aggregate dietary risk, whether from processed or unprocessed foods, are very important. Imbalanced diets and those diseases also require costly treatment that might be in excess of $1 trillion within the next 10 years. And as we all know, the food system is highly environmentally unsustainable when it comes to climate change, land use, biodiversity loss, freshwater use, and aquatic pollution. And if we don't change course, we really run the risk of exceeding key planetary boundaries or environmental limits to basically all aspects that are related to the food system. In order to avoid that, strong dietary changes would be needed. And here's just the percentage changes in 2050 if we wanted to adapt the mean recommendations of the Eat Lancet Commission. And you see that even in low-income countries, that is the far right here, LIC, even there would be a quite drastic reduction in red meat needed. And in the overall reduction is over 80%, which is really quite drastic, and quite some increases in fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and so on. So the big question is really how, if we know all that now, and there have been very many reports that highlighted the need for dietary change to preserve both health and the environment, how can we actually go about it? And what is fairly well established now in the behavioral change literature is really that there is no silver bullet. So one measure alone usually doesn't cut it, and we probably need integrated multi-component approaches. In particular, if we want to achieve or help people adopt diets that are so different to the fairly unhealthy and imbalanced diets that we have now. Those multi-component approaches can include media and education campaigns, such as labeling, consumer information, updating national dietary guidelines, but they should also include, if possible, fiscal measures such as taxation, subsidies, other economic incentives, including those for producers, such as reform of agricultural subsidies. Then there are school and workplace programs, local environmental changes. Those, if it goes well, hopefully have something to do with national dietary guidelines. And there are direct restriction and mandates, for example, for things that are proven to be carcinogenic. One can really think about those, for example. I want to spend a bit more time talking about national dietary guidelines, because as a medical community, that is something that you have that you can communicate, but that you might also have a say in when it comes to committees that formulate national dietary guidelines. And obviously, those are communicated directly when providing diet-related health advice in a clinical setting. So what are actually national food-based dietary guidelines? Well, often people think those are scientific documents, but that's really far from the truth. There are political, government-endorsed documents that are intended to provide context-specific recommendations and advice on healthy diets and lifestyle. If it goes well, as I said, they form the basis for educational programs and national food and nutrition policies. If you see it in that way, they're really an important starting point for any kind of food system regulation, in addition to being just a communication tool. In a study that we published last year in the British medical journal, BMJ, we analyzed all national dietary guidelines that we could get our hands on with respect to their healthiness and their implications for sustainability. That included transcribing them to actually provide a quantitative representation of those, doing an environmental analysis, doing a health analysis, and also comparing their performance with respect to health and environmental targets that the global community has signed up for. So where did we get them from? Well, fortunately, there is a big repository of all kinds of national dietary guidelines provided by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. They have dietary guidelines from all world regions, though, as you can see here, Europe is a bit overrepresented here if you compare how many European entries there are compared to, let's say, Africa. But nonetheless, there are about 100 of those. Not all of those are always useful. Sometimes you can't translate them. Sometimes the links are broken. But anyway, we try to use most of those. Then we supplemented that by global dietary guidelines, like those provided by the World Health Organization and the Eat Lancet Commission on healthy diets from sustainable food systems. In order to analyze the diets, we needed to translate what the guidelines say to what we think people reading those guidelines would actually do. And that was really the first problem, because most dietary guidelines are super qualitative. So they don't give you an exact value. They don't tell you what the serving size is. They say maybe something like eat more or less, but what does that mean? So we needed to come up with basically a coding table to say, okay, if there is an exact value, just do that, and you get a very low uncertainty score. If you provide, if you give a value, but you don't say the serving size, so let's say 3 servings of fruit and veg or so, or 5 servings of fruit and veg, then the uncertainty increases, and so on. So and like that, we could basically determine how clear and easy to understand dietary guidelines really are to a representative consumer. Of course, quantitative measures are not everything, but if there are none whatsoever in the guideline document, we think it really has not that much informational value. Then we paired those with environmental footprints for different environmental domains and different food groups in different regions. And as you're well aware by now, on most of those domains, animal source foods have really quite an outside impact when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, freshwater use, and nitrogen phosphorus use. Then we funneled the representation of diets into a comparative risk assessment, similar to what the global burden of disease is doing. And we included as risk factors red and processed meat consumption, fruit consumption, veg consumption, nut consumption, legume consumption, fish, whole grains, and imbalanced body mass index, meaning underweight, overweight, and obesity. And we tracked the impact on those 4 causes of death. Then the last problem we really had was, well, whilst some dietary guidelines might improve the, let's say, the environmental impact relative to current diets, if your current diet is super out of whack, that doesn't really mean anything, right? So if you have an average, high income country diet, reducing your emissions by 10% is basically meaningless. So we came up with what we call a global sustainability test, where we basically extend the national diet and the national recommended diet to all countries around the world, thereby preserving the differences in production methods and the differences in mortality rates, and assessing if everybody would follow, let's say, the recommended diet in Germany, would we actually be able to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, the Aichi biodiversity targets, the Sustainable Development Goals when it comes to water withdrawals or nutrient pollution, or the NCD agenda. And by that, we could basically determine if a dietary guideline is in line with those targets, or if even after adopting those guidelines, that specific country would basically outsource responsibility for meeting those targets. And all of those targets, the global community has basically signed up on. So the first thing we found out was, well, most dietary guidelines are really have a very high uncertainty score. So the ones that are good here, you see, for example, China, the US. That doesn't mean anything with respect to whether they're good or not. It just means that they were very clearly formulated. Brazil and Canada, they are usually highlighted as good examples of talking about processed foods, but unfortunately they didn't provide any quantitative data that we could use in any way. So that was a bit of a pity. When you look at on which food groups those dietary guidelines were actually fairly concrete on, then you saw on average most included concrete statements on fruits and vegetables, milk, sugar, fish, and then it became a bit less clear on legumes, eggs, red meat, nuts and seeds, whole grains. Processed meat was fairly bad, and maintaining energy balance was actually not so bad. If you look at by region, European countries were fairly clear in comparison, North America as well, and African and Latin American countries were the least concrete. From the global ones, the WHO was unfortunately fairly not really clear, even if you took multiple guideline documents together that they provide, whereas the Eat Lancet Commission, because I guess also because it is set out to be fairly comprehensive, provided quantitative targets on all of those different food groups. Most of the recommendations recommended what you might expect: increase legume intake, whole grain intake, reduce meat intake broadly, and maintain energy balance. And here you see how those differ. Because there were not so many for the WHO, a couple of them are missing here, and if you compare the different values, for most of those, the Eat Lancet recommendations are more progressive than what you find in those in the different country level ones. The impact of those recommendations, if people were eating according to those, of course not penalizing if they already meet any, was that premature mortality could decrease quite a bit. And here you see where it could decrease most. In total, we estimated that adopting on dietary guidelines would, on average, in those countries that have dietary guidelines, reduce premature mortality by about 15%. And you see here where that is relatively more and relatively less. In Africa, the mortality from non-communicable diseases is still relatively lower, so therefore you see here less. But in all of those countries, you also see that the adopting WHO guidelines is relatively similar, even though they just contain a limited amount of food groups. But adopting the Eat Lancet recommendations is always associated with a greater reduction in premature mortality of about a third. When it came to environmental impacts, and here I just show you the greenhouse gas emissions, we found that because most dietary guidelines recommended a reduction in red and processed meat, you see also a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. On average, that was about 18% here. And you also see that very often that was actually compensated by recommended increases in the intake of dairy, particularly so in the Near East, which recommended really kind of crazy amounts of dairy intake of different kinds. And again, in comparison, the Eat Lancet recommendations resulted in a much deeper reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental resource use. Now, the big thing was how many targets could actually be achieved, and that was a bit of a shocker to us. So 98% of all those dietary guidelines we looked at did not meet at least one of those global health and environmental targets, and only two-thirds fulfilled fulfilled only one or two targets. So that was really quite shocking. And you can see here hardly no country in a high income region performed very well. And the only ones that performed relatively well, like India, Indonesia, Sierra Leone, they have baseline diets that are so low in animal source foods that they basically didn't recommend a crazy increase in those. And even if they didn't provide very strong targets, if they didn't provide any, we assumed that people don't change their diets. So basically their diets, even after taking into account their dietary guidelines, were still fairly sustainable, whereas the recommendations on animal source foods were really not very progressive in most high-income countries. So which resulted in basically those targets not being met. Here you see by how far they are off, and the biggest target that led to concerns was the greenhouse gas emissions target. So that was meeting the Paris Climate Agreement, the food-related portion of the Paris Climate Agreement. And you see here that especially North American dietary recommendations were performed very, very poorly. So if you want to say, if you want to have a soundbite, that would basically mean if everybody in the world would eat like it is recommended in North America, we would need 4 Earths to dilute the food-related emissions enough to meet the Paris Climate Agreement if they all had the other sectors to a similar degree. So really woefully out of whack, and even the WHO recommendations were out of whack, which was really concerning. As I said, much of it was due to animal source foods, which you see here. So for having dietary guidelines that are both healthy, but also in line with environmental limits, is really essential to get progressive recommendations on reducing specifically red and processed meat in diets. So a couple of takeaway messages that I already mentioned. So dietary guidelines if done well, do inform national policies. Many of them are at the moment not sustainable when adopted globally and could in most cases also be healthier. The reason is here the lag for limits for animal source foods, and updating guidelines in line of sustainability concerns in addition to health concerns is a really essential first step for progressive food policy reform. Further takeaway messages are that the Eat Lancet recommendations or something similar could really be a good starting point. They resulted in a third greater reduction in premature mortality, more than 3 times greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and a general attainment of global health and environmental targets. Here's an example for the UK, but there are similar examples in all high-income countries. And you see here how the reductions of those recommendations compared to the national dietary guidelines that are in place at the moment. What we think is also important is provide concrete examples. So of course you can't say, oh, everybody eats exactly like Eat Lancet recommended, but what would be really important is to have different dietary patterns, and indeed that was something that we did within the Eat Lancet report. We didn't look only at one diet. We looked at flexitarian diets that are in line with the recommendations, pescatarian diets, vegetarian diets, and vegan diets, and we regionalized those for every country based on preferences for different staple foods, different fruits, vegetables, different seafood, and so on. And we think providing concrete examples instead of one set of recommended diet is also very important to take not only different parts of the population by the hand, but also to be less paternalistic. The shocking thing even was, and that is a point for reflection, is that even if you have dietary guidelines and even if you have a process by which you develop national dietary guidelines, hardly anybody at the moment is eating according to those. So this shows you how the number of recommendations achieved, and if it's red, it's 0, and you see many are red or orange. So hardly any country actually adheres to their own dietary recommendations. So that means we really need a proper investment in health promotion programs and policy coherence, so that dietary guidelines that maybe are not basically neutralized by whatever is going on in whatever agricultural department is passed in terms of agricultural production support. And here you see, if you just use standard methods of cost benefit analysis and something that is called the value of statistical life, just the health benefits that you would get from people adopting national dietary guidelines or more progressive ones could be in excess of 20% of GDP. So this is really massive. In the UK, where the health system is public, basically the value of avoided deaths if people actually switch to healthy diets would be double the whole budget of the public health system here. So those are massive amounts that politicians really need to take seriously, and that are not taking seriously at the moment. I have a few more things on other measures for incentivizing dietary changes, but I should briefly ask how much more time I have.
I think we should come to the end.
Okay, that's fine. So if you guys are interested, check out what we did about fiscal measures. As I said, providing information, as you saw on this picture, is really not enough. You need also proper health promotion campaigns, and those could include fiscal measures such as taxing foods with respect to their greenhouse gas emissions, with respect to their health impacts, and reforming agricultural subsidies. And we did studies on all of those 3 aspects. And if you're interested, check out those references here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. And so we can open the round for discussions. And I would like to start with a question for Ms. Pittel, because I think that's not a question that will be like on some kind of, I don't know, common ground for all the others, because it's not only focused on nutrition, because you gave us this really nice solutions and from the report, and I would like to bring it into a more like practical perspective and on a tangible example, because you mentioned the rainforest in the Amazonas, and that's, I think, a really good example where we need urgent action to stop the deforestation. And so I would like to ask you, what kind of solutions or approaches do you think could really stop the deforestation, especially in a country where you can't, where this like doing international cooperation is not like the way you can go actually.
I mean, especially the Amazon is of course a prime example for the difficulties you actually encounter. I mean, having the government in place that you have currently in place, at least on a governmental level, there seems hardly be much that you can actually do. Although one thing one should probably consider, and I'm an economist, so of course I would think of that, is that especially people like these governments, not naming names here, are usually very self-interested. So at least trying to make these self-interests align with the interests of the planet can be an approach that you can actually take. So for example, with respect to, I mean, we kind of developed in our report what we called a leasing system. It sounds kind of weird and sounds like a little bit like colonial land grabbing kind of style, but that's not what's meant at all. So the idea is basically go there and have long-term contracts to lease large areas of land. That can be one country, it can be an alliance of countries. And on the one hand, you have, if you lease the land, you have the say about what can be done there. But of course, you can't do it like ignoring everything around you. So you have to do it in cooperation with at least the local governments. And if you have governments that are not rational at all, can hope for a better election result at some point, then it gets really difficult. We have to admit that. But I think the potentials that these kind of more unconventional approaches actually have has not been in any way been reaped yet.
Thank you very much, Karin. I think all three presentations have clearly laid out the case for change and how much we have a gap and how huge the gap is. And so the question is for all of us, kind of how can we intervene, framing it a bit from a different way. What gave me some, not hope, but ideas when you were, Karin, when you were starting to talk about change agents as one of the levels of interaction. And you could also play with the change agents are not only working as change agents, they can also be a change agent in the EU and in global corporations. So you have within corporations with large institutions within them, you can have change agents and you can connect on a global scale. So, and then bringing together what we don't have so far is the action which is focusing on health and environment at the same time. So you have environmental change agents, you have health change agents, but you don't have environmental change agents, environment and health change agents. So that's kind of could be an innovation where we hear everyone listening now, because that's our basic notion. We're doing this Planetary Health Academy in order to be equipped and empowered to move into transformative action, including kind of the panel and the presenters. So that is an idea that pops up for me, but it would mean that we have to kind of play with being innovative, imagining, working on the imagining different solutions, perhaps even dropping the national guideline idea and tackling it from a very different side. So this is was a long kind of thing, but both to Anja and Marco, what is your sense of this idea of a new perspective of change agents coming in and starting to intervene into this huge game? Anja, you want to start?
Okay, I try. So I agree with you. Would be nice to have such change agents. But I think really important is that we also have those change agents in, let's say, the food industry or in the retail So in and the people who sell the food, you know, these are big companies. They now have all their boards for environmental sustainability, and they know they invest in this, and they have it there, and they are really important players. These stakeholders, we need to integrate them. So we are scientists in this in this field, but we need to integrate, you know, the people from industry, and what we do is we train our students, and they work not only in science, but they go into industry, and we have to look more for, I think, the players there with industry.
So you vaccinate them to be future kind of Trojan horses within the industry, for example.
Can I ask something on that?
Sabine?
Now I just want to ask Anja, like, how do you draw the line between engaging and really hoping they'll do something good and supporting greenwashing? Because that's a risk, of course.
Yeah, of course, it's a risk, but I think we cannot do without them. I mean, we can say it has to be like this, but if they don't do it, you know, we are lost. So I think it's important to integrate them, and of course, they know about the problem, and they know sometimes much better than we as scientists do what can really be done and how it can be done. So I think it's important to integrate them to a discussion with the scientists and for solutions, to have them at the table, and
Marco, you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I'm much more critical when it comes to the food industry, echoing probably what has been written in the global pandemic report as well. I mean, I think if you want change agents, you really need to get them to put pressure on policymakers, or get them to become policymakers to actually do something. And I mean, I think if you look at example after example, change has only happened if some kind of progressive piece of policy came forward. I mean, in lots of places that now have a bit of reduction in, for example, sugary drinks consumption, that has really only happened after governments introduced levies on sugary drinks or taxes on sugary drinks of some sort or other. So I really think if you want to have change, you really need to press your policymakers. And you can't go around every person in a country to say change. You really need to press for having the right incentives, so it's easy for people to choose healthy and sustainable diets, and that you only get if the right public incentive system through policies are in place.
Karin, please.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say I think both are right. I mean, you can't have only change agents and no support by framework conditions, etc. Then nothing will probably happen in the long run. But change agents at the same time can exert a lot of pressure on governments. I mean, just look at Fridays for Future. I mean, there's a lot that actually happened from that. So they should be supported by governments, but sometimes governments also need a kickstart and actually to act. And so I think that's a fruitful interaction that should be fostered. And we see in the past that it actually can work. Also with government, I mean, we see that there, with industry, we see that there is change happening. For example, the EU, on the EU level with respect to sustainable investment, which is not only climate, but also other types of sustainability criteria. And that kind of also supports more sustainable investment in industry. At the same time, change from within is of course also very necessary. So I think it has to be a combination. It can't be just one level.
Mm.
I would say, because as we're already like short in time, that we get some questions from the audience at least. So Sophie collected them. Maybe you can share some with us.
Yes, thank you very much for the really nice presentations, giving us a global view, but also an individual view. And the chat was very lively. So maybe one question regarding to what you've been discussing just right now. Someone asked to those of you advising larger bodies or governments, whether you feel you're being listened to, and maybe also whether you feel like, with the vested interests being at play, how do you experience that in your work? Are you being listened to as scientists?
I guess
Maybe
one
that's a
person
good-
has to start.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's a good
Fine.
question for you, actually. So please.
Okay. It's pros. It's light and shadow. It's both. I mean, I've been, for example, on the WBGU, on the global advisory body on the German advisory body on global change since 5 years, and we have written 2 flagship reports in this time. The one that I just presented, and the other one on digitization and sustainability. And the digitization is a little bit longer ago, like 2 or 3 years. And we have seen actually that it has impacted research agendas. It has impacted agendas on the EU level, but also we had actually quite fruitful discussions also with members of the industry. Of course, you'll never get in a situation where like everything you recommend is taken up, and sometimes it's more and sometimes is less. So it can be very frustrating as well. But I think having a sound argument and also attempting to show that it's doable, I think that is both very helpful in that respect.
Thanks. I'll just jump right to the next question because we have so many. This one's probably for you, Marco. They were wondering why there can be such a big difference between the WHO and Eat Lancet recommendations. Where are they coming from? What is the story behind that?
So unfortunately, the WHO recommendations don't recommend anything. So, I mean, you really only have your 5 fruits and veg per day, and try to, I think they say, try to limit processed meat and have not too much sugar. So they have a quantitative sugar target in there, not more than 10% of total energy intake, if possible, not more than 5%. And attaining a healthy body weight. So those are the 4 ones that the WHO has come around to publicly support, but they have never had any proper target on red and processed meat as such, which is really a shame. And even though they might in some policy targets agree that it's a problem, they still haven't like formulated very clear guidelines on that. And I think it's especially problematic. And the same is true for the Food and Agriculture Organization, by the way. And the same, and both of that is really problematic because very many countries in low income settings use the WHO or FAO documents to develop their own national dietary guidelines. So it would be really important to get some proper guidance and science-based recommendations in there. And that's what we've been calling for. But you know, coming to the fruitfulness of discussion, what we hear then is that, oh, it's too politically contentious to say people should not eat more meat than this, if they're even, especially if they are in low income settings. But you know, red and processed meat is also unhealthy in low income settings. But it's a painful discussion, and there are narratives that are very sticky, that are really hard to overcome, especially if you talk to people more on the policy making side, right, that have to deal with potential backlashes that are related to those sticky narratives.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think we also have experience with these kind of sticky narratives in Germany. Yeah, especially around meat, but also around mobility. We do have those. Maybe going to you, Anja. Actually, what was shown in the chat is that there were really specific questions about, is this and that food? Is it ultra processed? Does it classify? So there's kind of a confusion what was classifies as ultra processed foods. Are there really no healthy processed foods? What about whole grain bread? What about vegan meat alternatives? How do we distinguish without applying, oh, it's natural as a parameter? Maybe you can help out with that.
A very good question. It's not that food processing per se is not good. So food processing solves a lot of problems. It makes food more digestible, and per se food processing is good for, of course, to provide us all with healthy food and with safe food and so on. It's not the food processing that is has adverse effects, but the ultra ultra-processing means that it's a food formulation. So it's food with very highly refined ingredients and a lot of additives and so on. So food that is very energy dense. You need to chew it a lot, so you can eat it, you know, a lot before you get satiation. So you get satisfied with the food. So you can eat a lot from it, and it's very delicious. So very fat and very sweet at the same time. So fat and sugar combination. So that's a big problem. And there's actually no very good scientific based definition. It's only the NOVA score that I was have introduced in my slides, and this is you know, a very crude estimation of the processing. And so scientists debate a lot about the use of this NOVA score. But this NOVA score, if you use it, it shows a very good correlation with non-communicable diseases and even mortality or even aging and so on. So it's very fascinating to look what is behind this. And there are some attempts to improve the NOVA score, like the SIGA score, for instance. It's not easy to define a food according to the SIGA score. You need to know much about the food to do this. This is a problem, and all the big databases that are used in the epidemiologic studies, they cannot do it because the estimation of the food intake from the subjects is very crude. You have just food frequency, for instance, or dietary record, and you cannot do this easily. But industry can do this, and there is of course an app. You can use apps, for instance, to scan the food and to see the NOVA score, and then you get an estimation with the app, for instance.
That was really helpful. Thank you very much. I would have one question for Karin. There, you mentioned fish intake, or maybe also other people can add to it if you feel like. There were a lot of questions about fish as a valuable component of our diet. So there were several questions concerning this. Isn't it harmful for our planet in view of excessive overfishing? What about our health in view of heavy metal pollution? And what about the consequences of getting fish of antibiotics in the water? So maybe you can add a bit to that discussion.
Sure, but I think I relate the health related questions probably to the experts here. Might make more sense. Of course, from a global perspective, having too much fish in your diet is also problematic, because basically all of the seas, of the oceans, are either fish to capacity or overfished already. So we should not only not exceed the level that we have today, but also lower it. So on the one hand, of course, the methods that we actually fish with have to, in many cases, change, especially with respect to industrialized fishing. Then aquaculture to some extent can alleviate the pressure, but of course also really depends on the type of fish that you actually have and on the type of agriculture you do. Not all is good. Some can be even more harmful. So having fish in the diet, as far as I understand, is really healthy. But as far as I also understand, it should not be too much. I mean, in the planetary health diet, there is fish in there, but it's also not excessive amounts of fish. It's not that you replace like one-to-one fish, meat by fish. That was perhaps the overfishing component, not health.
Yeah, if I can jump in on the health bit briefly. So, I mean, it's also a sticky narrative that fish is very healthy, but actually, if you look at the epidemiological evidence, it's really not super clear. So the food group evidence is fairly different depending on what continent you, for example, look at. So how you prepare fish apparently has a big influence. So if it's fried fish, doesn't have any positive impact. And then fish oils like omega-3 fatty acid capsules, they also only work at people they only contribute to some beneficial effects in people with pre-existing conditions. And the same is probably true for fish consumption as a whole. So whilst it might not be unhealthy, and in some circumstances healthy, is really not, you know, the big thing that you must have fish all the time. So it's really a thing that, yeah, you can have some point, but you also need to be mindful that fish can be as environmentally impactful as basically at least pork, and on average is as impactful as poultry. So you shouldn't have too much of it for sure. And most of it would be expected to come from aquaculture that is also open to lots of mismanagement. So if you want to be sustainable with your fish diet, try to eat small pelagic fish that are fish close to the surface, or filter feeders like mussels, or ditch fish, and eat algae. So those have very low environmental impacts, and you can even be on a plant-based diet with those.
Great, thank you for that. And I think with that, I'll give back to Martin and Sylvia.
Yeah, Martin, you're still muted. But I think the variety of questions, and there's still like so many questions in the chat, which we couldn't like pose to you now, or it couldn't be answered. So it really shows the dimension and the importance of this topic. And also, I think sometimes a little bit of confusion about this topic, because there are so many opinions and they're either influenced by industry or not. And it's really difficult sometimes to differentiate what is true and what isn't true. Martin, do you have a final question?
Yeah, but I think it is clear that we know enough that we can move into action. We have to get deeper into it. We have to understand more. So that would be my final question to all of you. If you are part of our networks of change agents, which also have, you know, change agents in government, in industries, and in all kinds of different places, what would be the one intervention you would focus on in the next 6 to 12 months? So what would be your own, but also for us, because we always have to focus. We cannot do 15 things. What would you focus on? Anja, please.
Not an easy question, but you know, it's even beyond my expertise what I suggest now. But I think it's so important to change, to study consumers' behavior, how to change consumers' behavior, how to approach the consumers, and it goes beyond, of course, advertising and what we see on television. It's a very complex thing how people decide what they want to buy. You know, it's not a decision that you go in the supermarket and you study all the labels and you look at the Nutri-Score and the Nova Score, and even if it would be all on the food, you would, you know, there would be so many other drivers of your decision, and I think it's much important to understand this better and to manipulate the consumption and to facilitate the healthy and sustainable decisions of consumers. You have to really you understand the whole picture and go for this. So I think this is a very interesting and important thing to do.
Marco, what would be your intervention?
I would say that always depends what country you're in, because I mean all of those discussions are formed by what is on the national agenda and what is relevant to a specific location. If you're in Germany, I think the two most pressing things is really making sure any agricultural subsidy reform is health sensitive and environmentally friendly, and it's long overdue to make the common agricultural policy greener and healthier. And that is under discussion. I mean, I guess the train is almost passed on that one again, but I think there is still some limited scope. And I think in Germany, it also does make sense to press for better national dietary guidelines. So, and in most countries, I think it would. And as I said, I think that those are good housekeeping, and they need to be in order to press for more public health promotion campaigns and then work on those.
Karin?
Yeah, Marco, thank you very much for mentioning the common agricultural policy, so I can abstain from that. That's helpful, because I had two. Probably under the impression also of a policy paper that we are writing right now, which is on climate neutrality, and the discussions we had also about the way that developing countries at the moment suffer from the consequences of the corona crisis. I think my foremost push would be to get governments actually to acknowledge what this crisis is doing to developing countries. Many people, hunger increasing, people impoverished, and using this opportunity and actually divert money in that direction, divert investment, and using that as well to make agricultural systems more sustainable, and also to support actually healthy diets in these countries. I mean, when you, just one sentence, when you sometimes talk to policymakers at the moment, they tell you that the money is already distributed. Nothing can be done anymore. And I think that is very problematic.
Thank you very much. So I hand over to you, Sylvia, to close the session.
Yeah, thank you very much for all your really great inputs. And yeah, also the good ideas I think that you gave in the final answer. So hopefully they will be implemented. I wanted to say some, but actually they all need to be implemented. So hopefully all of them will be implemented. And I think all of us here in this round will do their part in trying to do so. And so, yeah, thank you for your participation again. And next time we're going to look into the health consequences. So we're going to a little bit more into this clinical view of climate change and health and planetary health. So thank you for your participation, and also thank you to the audience for joining us again, and have a nice evening. Bye.